Let's go.
All right, we are going to get started. In our next session, we are rethinking shelter to weather the storm. Climate change is impacting every aspect of the future of housing, where we build, how we design, and what products we use. Today's panelists are making homes and communities more resilient and safer, and are redefining how we think about where and how we will live in the future. Our moderator for this talk is the VP of Programming at Hanley, where she develops and curates content to provide audiences with a fresh perspective on the biggest issues in housing innovation today. Please welcome, along with our entire panel, our moderator, Jennifer Castenson.
Thank y'all. Thank you. The lady up top's supposed to get your things started. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back in. So we're going to make this really fun and engaging, hopefully. But I want to start it off with why are we here talking about this? And actually, KP kind of kicked it off for me because he was talking about how the industry could make focus on sustainability and how the industry is responsible for a lot of the issues. So buildings consume 40% of US's annual energy and emit nearly half of the carbon dioxide. So a big contributor to why we are facing climate change threats. And the climate change is impacting all aspects of our lives. It's heating up the air, which is adding humidity, which is leading to more storms. In some areas, it's leading to droughts. And it's actually leading to death. So it's a massively serious issue. And not only deaths, but also huge economic impact. So if we think about some of the most recent storms and wildfires, in California, in 2018, the wildfires caused 44 deaths and $400 billion of economic impact. Hurricane Harvey, just 2 years ago, was 89 deaths and $130 billion of economic impact. And Hurricane Katrina, before that, 1,833 deaths and $166 billion worth of impact. And then I also mentioned droughts, which are an issue, and Dominique was talking about today, that's actually forecast to be a bigger issue in the future in the Midwest. But the 2012 drought caused 123 deaths, and it had a $34 billion impact. So definitely something that we need to be thinking about, and I am so honored to have these three here with me today to talk about how we're going to face that from a real estate perspective, and I want to go ahead and ask you to introduce yourselves. So go ahead.
There we go. Okay. Dominique Davison. I am the founding principal of Draw Architecture and Urban Design. We're an interdisciplinary firm based in Kansas City, Missouri, and we formed a sister company called Planet Impact, which is a tech startup that helps building professionals and owners to better understand how to optimize for building performance for energy, water, and stormwater.
Hi, my name's John Phillips Bourne. I work at AECOM 1.0, not the aforementioned 2.0, which is yet to come. AECOM, it sounds like people know, it's a full-service, large, global environment, architect, engineer, design build firm. I lead our climate adaptation practice for the Americas. So in that space, I work with our clients to help them understand what climate change will mean for them and what they can do about it. And I also work very closely with a lot of our different people in different disciplines, different geographies, to help them understand how climate change needs to be a consideration in the work they do, whether that's design a road or build a building or mitigate wetlands.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Schreiber. I'm the COO of Hanley Residential. We are a multifamily owner operator, developer, builder. We've been in existence for 40 years and are in 9 different markets. I think that makes us one of the key slow adopters of real estate technology that previous panels were complaining about. So I will do my best to explain how we could become a quicker adopter if that is, in fact, what we need to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Fred. So first question to you, John and Dominique. Can you put the climate change issue into context for the audience and talk about what are the major concerns facing us in the short term?
Well, I think it is if not the, one of the most important questions that we have, and I think it's really important to remember that the answer really depends on where you are. I mean, certainly you mentioned a lot of and KP brought up that this market space contributes a lot to climate change. So I think, no matter where you are, there's a lot that can be done to make your building and your operations and your processes more climate neutral, making sure that they are as low emitting as possible and that the footprint that you make is as small as possible. But on the other side of the spectrum, in terms of thinking about impacts of climate change, which is the space that I spend more time thinking about, certainly depending on where you live, you have to think about this a lot more and a lot sooner. So if you were in coastal areas like Norfolk or Miami or the parts of the Gulf Coast, issues of sea level rise and coastal flooding and extreme weather events are here and now challenges. But also, it's not just a coastal flooding issue. It's a middle of the U.S. flooding issue. It's a drought issue. It's an extreme heat issue, which kills more people than any other extreme weather event. And are our buildings equipped and adapt for extreme heat and increasing temperatures? So it's not a very simple question to answer. It's very much contextual and location based.
We were surprised in the Kansas City area to find out that we're 5th most vulnerable city in the U.S. in terms of climate change, and that is because of the drought issue that we were talking about. So we think a lot about the coast, and certainly the impacts of hurricanes have been hugely devastating along the coast, and we're all, those are top of mind. But it's predicted that there will be a 35-year-long drought in the Midwest and the Southwest. Sometime in the next 100 years, or 80 years actually. It's not even that far out. And that's something that is pretty tough to plan for in terms of infrastructure improvements, but something that we need to be thinking about.
So are they better at predicting droughts than they are tomorrow's weather?
I don't know exactly how. I mean, they say it's an 80% probability on this, and usually 80% probability means it's going to rain, right? So, yeah.
Sure. So how do you guys each see that equating to a threat to real estate? And Fred, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think the way real estate, especially commercial real estate, thinks about investments is it's a risk management business. I mean, it is traditionally a more risk averse investor base, and so but fundamentally, real estate suffers from the fact that we are holding long-term assets and covering them with insurance is the primary kind of risk mitigation tool we have, and the reality is that risk is repriced annually. And so, you go in and buy a property with an expectation of an exit 10 years from now, for instance. The reality is you may have a pretty good idea of what your insurance is going to price out for year 1. You have no idea what year 2 is. And so I think the way, large owners of real estate will continue to think about climate change and resilience is that there will be a strong correlation between a portfolio, its resilience, and what its exposure is to insurance premium increases year over year. And so, that doesn't mean that all risk is going to be avoided, and the winners will be the people who find the niche in the middle of the country that somehow avoids drought and forest fires and storms. But it'll be the people who think about how a portfolio and its risk is measured and how they can mitigate where insurance will fail.
do you guys think? How are you helping, Dominique, real estate investors, developers think about the threat of climate change?
Well, our whole approach, our mission is to remove barriers to for architects and engineers to actually get to net zero. Our whole idea is let's try to avoid any further progress in terms of this climate change crisis that we're in. And I mean, obviously, the mitigation piece and resiliency is hugely important because we're already in the midst of a crisis. But where we're really focused is how do we stop the problem from becoming any worse as quickly as possible. And so our focus with Planet Impact is trying to help people see the metrics, help see the value, understand that this is a good investment to try to go net zero now, and that the technology is there, the possibilities in pretty much every climate zone in the US at least, it is feasible financially with the correct financial partners to achieve net zero. And so, or however close to the Architecture 2030 challenge you want to get. So that's our goal is how do we show people those metrics, get them motivated, make it easy, make it fast, make it collaborative, help them along that integrative design path in order to push their clients, lean into the conversation on climate change and say this really needs to happen. It needs to happen now, and we're thinking about your investment of real estate, not just first costs, but into the future.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just thinking about what Fred was saying on kind of the risk profile, and I guess we can look at it from the asset owner, and so there are certain things that you can do if you're the asset owner to reduce risk that are about kind of where you keep your critical infrastructure, whether that's a generator or a storage tank of sorts, or you can raise a building. So there's risk from that building asset owner perspective. But then we also work on the kind of municipal side, working to kind of upgrade or update building codes to, think more about future changes. And that's a slow process. And while, there are examples of cities across the country that are, updating building codes to adjust for floodplains or other changing conditions. Again, that's I wouldn't call that the norm yet. And then I think there's the reality that you are allowed to build in places where maybe you shouldn't be allowed to build, and that's an even slower change to make. And as long as people are allowed to build in high-risk places, they, in many cases, will, and maybe that's okay. But again, that's something that as climate change and the associated impacts keep occurring, especially in certain areas, in floodplains, coastal areas, I think that's something that the industry and kind of society at large in those areas will have to think about if they want to make that change, and we shouldn't allow people to build in those areas.
Sure. So, go ahead, Dominique.
I was just going to tack onto that because we were talking about this a little bit over lunch in terms of the technology side and the opportunity there with the codes, right? If codes are being slow to really adjust to climate change, then how do we use technology to make sure that we're making the right decisions or planning accordingly? And one example was the rainfall data, and that the EPA's method of logging that hasn't been updated, and so to reflect the current rainfall data that's actually happening. So we can be using technology to scrape more current information, and then we should be planning with that in mind.
So one of the reasons you guys are here today and why we're talking about this is that there are many, many different opportunities and different ways that this could be disrupted, and new ways that technology can infiltrate into this process and make us smarter, make investors smarter, make developers smarter, like Dominique is doing. But how can we leverage technology in a way that mitigates the impacts of climate change? And John, let's start with you.
Well, that's a tricky one for me. Again, some of the biggest ways I think that we can reduce our risk is by some of these more mundane kind of policy tools that we're looking at. Again, kind of reducing the incentives to live in places where people shouldn't. Certainly, there are a lot of ways in the building technology that you can use improved design to kind of reduce impacts of high wind events. Again, I wouldn't call these like super technology improvements, but just considering where you're putting assets. And it sounds simple, but there's a lot of things that shouldn't have water touch them that are still within areas that get flooded rather frequently. So my answers aren't very profound in the technology upgrades, but I think it's something worth noting that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, to make our own investments and assets more resilient, just from kind of looking at some of those base things.
Fred, I know I worked with you guys recently to work on a concept community for net zero, net positive. So I know you guys are constantly thinking about it, but how are you leveraging technology at Hanley?
Yeah, I mean, I think KP in the previous group nailed it. I mean, the way we build buildings today is the exact same way we built them 40 years ago. If you are building a wood frame multifamily building, chances are it may be the same superintendent that was building it 40 years ago. This is his last project, but it's the same technology. There's not been a lot of efficiency, panelization, things brought to it. I think what ends up happening is we fall into the ruts of how we have always traditionally done it, underwrote that, and that gets you just barely to what you need in order to move forward. And so as the Kateras or whatever technologies come along that can free some of the wasted money and wasted efficiency and wasted time that it takes to build these things, that does enable money to be spent elsewhere. There are plenty of items that we would love to spend money on to improve the quality, the resident experience, all of that. And it's really hard to justify when, at a fundamental level, to get an investor to sign on, you've got to hit a certain return threshold. I mean, a 10-year-old project, we are spending a fortune 10 years later fixing water intrusion. I mean, it is almost a certainty that water is getting into the building 10 years out. And it is because we're building it the same way, it's the same type of skin systems, and there ought to be either an improvement in materials, techniques, construction that would enable that, and whether it's design technology that improves the way that design and construction interacts, or it's a material science issue. It's there is money that can be made out there, and there's the construction industry is especially ripe for disruption and for new technology.
I just want to add on to that. I mean, we are seeing this slow increase in requests in thinking about kind of site assessment and just kind of where you build. That isn't just thinking about kind of your historic questions or looking at kind of your historic FEMA or current FEMA flood maps, but thinking about how, if you have a building and it's supposed to last 40 to 50 years, how are the considerations of where you're doing that development, thinking about what those conditions might be 10, 20, 50 years out, and how your current your building decisions, your decisions about where you build at all, take that into consideration.
So next question is about proofs of concept. Like, who's doing this right? Who's using technology? Who's applying it? I know you just talked about Katera, but like in terms of climate change, there's Bjarke Ingels' group who's designed that floating cities concept because the rising waters. Any other examples of who's doing it right? Dominique?
I think Karen Timberlake is doing some really incredible work. They've been really focused on sustainability and resiliency in their practice for quite a while. They're also innovators. They're writing software. They invest 10% of their net profit into a research and design model, and that's who we've kind of modeled ourselves after is that firm because we really like what they're doing.
I guess just a thought on that, not thinking about individuals, more on the kind of municipal side. So, we do see cities, like a New York City that's doing a whole lot of kind of resilient design now in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. So there was a lot of funding put in and really exciting competitions to redesign Lower Manhattan or the Meadowlands across New Jersey. And so we see really exciting opportunities like that. There are projects like that in San Francisco and New Orleans. Most of those cases come post this giant, disaster event. And I think what we don't often see is that kind of innovation or resilient design occurring in places that are trying to be proactive. And so again, there are some kind of best practices occurring in some of these big cities that have had this windfall in these kind of really, unfortunate post-disaster scenarios. But that's where we look.
And then there are cities that are, like we talked about, kind of ignoring the issue. So are a little bit more concerned about getting the development, supporting the economy, getting the development dollars in now and growing that way. So Fred, we talked about this on our call. How do you balance the community needs with the project needs?
That's a very good, a very hard question. I'd say, for the most part, I was the Atlanta development partner at Hanley for 10 years and still am closely involved with all our development efforts here. And I'd say, without criticism of our company or our design team or the city, for the most part, these deals are still very transactional relationships. You're trying to get a deal across. The city is managing that deal. The neighborhood's got its own interest in mind, and it's not always, obvious or easy to figure out how to be collaborative in a way that works for everybody at the table. But it often does involve early communication and a kind of an integrated design and creative approach to it. One, we have a development that is a multi-phase development. We're about halfway through it, about 5 miles north of here in Buckhead. And it was a failed plan from the previous cycle. And the neighborhood was very angry about the previous density and the involvement the developer had with the relationship that the developer built with the neighborhood. And the big issue the neighborhood really felt, beyond traffic and schools and everything everybody always cares about, was that the neighborhood had historic flooding, because the city had old stormwater codes that didn't address the loss of pervious surface throughout the history of the city. And so one of the things we did in order to get our entitlements and get the neighborhood to buy in was we got the city and the neighborhood to agree to allow us to congregate or to aggregate our open space into a stormwater park. And so all of the open space for all 4 projects was combined into a 1-acre park that served as a stormwater detention center that kept above, well above the existing code, the stormwater from flowing downstream into that neighborhood. That was not a easy conversation all the time to have with them, but I think that ended up being a win-win. We were able to get something out of it that it made the underwriting work, made that extra incremental cost worth it. The neighborhood found a solution to an existing environmental problem that they were having trouble with, and the city, kind of got, both sides of the equation where they wanted it. They got development, they got impact dollars, but they also had the neighborhood and their constituents happy.
Nice. You guys have anything to add to that? No? All right. So what kind of technologies or what kind of ideas would you like to see tomorrow? What do you think is on the horizon? What's ripe for disruption?
I think we need a carbon tax. I think we need a policy that, so we have both the carrot and the stick approach on this. Because it's so hard with climate change, right? It's kind of that thing of like why it's really hard for people to quit smoking. Because, well, you might get cancer, like 20 years from now. Well, the data's there. We all know it's bad for you, right? But in terms of the reality to you right now, your decisions, it's kind of an abstract future concept, right? So I think policy's got to play the role of making it something that's a pain point now for everybody. Otherwise, we're not going to see the change, because it's just constantly going to be this sort of thing of like, well, my development right now isn't going to have that big of an impact. So, you know, maybe it's okay if my project isn't necessarily going to be as sustainable as we could make it. So we try with every project. Obviously, every client, you know, only can do so much, and we just try to help them along that process and maximize the potential of the project. So, you know, with a multifamily project, it might just be that we convince them to put in low flow fixtures. And that might seem like a small win, but for a 200 unit development, that's 600,000 gallons a year that you're saving. And one of the biggest costs for cities actually is pumping water around. So you're saving energy on a pretty big scale as well as water. So just trying to find those wins everywhere you can.
You were talking about smoking, and I'm just wondering, like, it popped in my head, like, I wonder if there's any litigation concerns in the future where a state would be suing developers or property managers for keeping people, and it's affecting their health or something like that. So, you know, who knows?
Let's hope not. Just personally, let's hope not.
Well, but you look at future generations, right? And, you know, our own kids, and they're looking at us and seeing what we're doing, and we're building the cities that are going to be the future for the next 50 years. And if we don't do it right, I think they are going to be pretty upset with us, and who knows what the repercussions are going to be.
Well, I mean, on the litigation side, I actually think there's a lot of climate change legal action that is kind of emerging, not specific on the kind of real estate side, but just in who knows, are you aware of risks, and are you not acting on them? And I think that's going to continue to emerge as a topic that goes forward. On the technology side, and again, this isn't a kind of a whiz-bang technology, but more and more we're getting asked about how nature-based solutions or green infrastructure can be a part of projects, whether that's on kind of the municipal side or on the kind of facility or kind of single asset side. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Nature-based solutions or green infrastructure isn't a solution to every challenge, but when you look for cost comparisons, oftentimes green infrastructure has a positive cost benefit. It also provides other benefits, you know, has a carbon mitigation benefit sometimes, has an amenity benefit. So I think, you know, again, we don't have to think about technology as being something on your phone necessarily, or kind of something you touch on a wall, but there are other ways that we can design projects or think about climate adaptation opportunities that are different from how they've been done in the past.
Right.
There are probably thousands of technologies I wish we could have. I would say one that I would love to see more progress in is, I think one of the earlier panels was talking about, will technology eliminate people, you know, in a very apocalyptic way. But I think that is a big burden for multifamily operators. I mean, our AMLE's turnover of on-site employees is 50% annually. You know, so our on-site people, we turn over half the staff every year. And so, you know, there's countless ways, from the property operating systems, you know, the real page and yardies and all that. But thinking of it from a climate change resiliency, I mean, we are building very complicated buildings, and we have all this knowledge and expertise that's, you know, harnessed on the upfront side between design teams, development teams, construction teams, and then we pass that building on to our operating staff, and we may train them, we may pass along, you know, Procore files or Revit files, or even let them walk through a BIM model, but then that staff leaves in 6 months, and there's another staff, and the construction and design teams and development teams have moved on to the next project, and, you know, they don't even know, you know, where, you know, our, you know, waterproofing consultant said we're most likely to have leaks. that knowledge is lost. And so some ability to combine, the real understanding and knowledge that goes into the building system and harness it so that it's user-friendly for a staff member to really capture and utilize in a way that kind of contemplates turnover and contemplates the fact that they also have residents in their leasing office every morning saying that their neighbor's too loud and they can smell marijuana smoke from the floor above. These people have kind of constant fires to be putting out, and yet the asset preservation piece of it, which is so important, I feel like is often deprioritized or made so hard for them to really kind of contemplate and deal with. So some technology that made that easier would be I think a real winner.
Awesome. So now we're going to go into a speed round where you guys can only answer true or false these questions. And I'm also going to select a lucky contestant from our audience to answer too. But the first one is true or false only. I'll start with you, Dominique. We'll just go down the line each time. Climate change is one of the biggest risks to our business in the next 5 years.
True.
True.
False.
I say false.
Question yourself. It will be easy to get funding to address this issue.
I can only say true or false.
Or true or false?
Oh. It depends on policy.
Trolls.
Did you just make up a word?
It depends on where you are.
I'll play by the rules. False.
Thank you.
False.
We have more time than we think to prepare.
False.
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 With the current administration in Washington, D.C., I think, there's no such thing as climate change.
So is that true, I guess? So it's a vote for true?
I think we're going with the true false again.
True-ish.
The general public understands the issue.
False.
Well, studies show it's improving.
It's a false.
False.
It's easy to adopt new technology. Ooh.
True.
If you want to.
False.
False.
On the surface it's true, but in actual reality it's false.
Everyone's really bad at this game. Fred, you're playing by the rules. The lack of understanding of weather events and the unpredictability affects my business.
I guess that's true.
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 The project objectives sometimes outweigh environmental concerns.
True.
Very true.
Yes, yes.
Unfortunately true.
Unfortunately true. Well, thank you guys for being on my panel today. I want to invite any questions from the audience in the last few minutes. Oh.
I guess I'll direct this at Dominique because it's a very noble endeavor that you're doing with your business. So let me ask you something though, because Silicon Valley has been criticized for the second wave of what they're doing. So if you think about the first wave of Silicon Valley, it was all about, in some ways, democratizing technology. And the second wave is all about taking the 1% and giving them things like so that they can get food delivered to their house or they can get a massage on demand. Now we're in Proc and construction tech and we're taking off now, right? And you look at that picture and the people in that picture are most likely the most underserved, poorest communities that are around there. Are we going to have a first wave where actually we address those big issues, or are we going to go right to the second wave and we're going to take care of the 1%?
I think that it's a really, really great question. And when we were looking at some data in preparation for this this day, one of the issues that's really interesting is the equity issue with climate change that you bring up. So the folks who are most vulnerable in terms of climate change are, of course, the folks who are the most economically disadvantaged. And so that means that the biggest pain point, the people who need us to solve this the most, aren't the ones who are investing in tech startups. So it does make this a social responsibility question, and we need the 1% to really step up and invest in solving this problem. We have some great investors and folks who are doing that, but there certainly needs to be a lot more action in that regard. The democratization of data is also something I'm very, very passionate about. And so as we're starting to look at building data and how we can optimize, for cities, smart building, smart city data, making sure that that remains open and transparent, and that we don't start seeing all of that going back to business as usual, where it's all proprietary and expensive and hard to access. So we're seeing some interesting strides in terms of certain companies like Voltron, who are coming out with really low-cost solutions that give people insights to their building data, and we're big supporters of that. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Any other questions?
It's on. I guess this question's for all three of you guys. The answer is, I know what the answer is, but my question is, we've talked about how the slow acceptance of science and technology into real estate for the whole day. Is that because, as you mentioned, a lot of real estate transactions are transactional, and the turnover is so quick? Is it that regulation, zoning, so like that has stifled the science and the technology to the point where you can't put in green technology because it doesn't come to code, but you can never get it to code because you can't put it in a building? Or is it a combination of all of it?
Yeah, you know the answer. It is a combination of all of them. I mean, I do think, I'll say I don't know that real estate is slow an adopter as everybody is saying it is. I think it has been an industry that hasn't had the focus as other industries have, and the nature of the assets is one that just it makes it so that there is less turnover. The product isn't being spit out every 3 days, and so the way investment decisions are made, we have 70 properties. We do 2 transactions, 3 transactions a year. So it's it is the way decisions are made and the way technology can be deployed within it is one that isn't necessarily always transactionally based. But I think the way the multifamily assets are managed is one that has struggled. I think that technology has made better inroads into the operating systems of how the properties are being managed, and hasn't made as many inroads into the way the buildings are actually being built and managed. And so, somebody was talking about why isn't anybody going after, trying to kill RealPage or Yardi or somebody like that. There are companies out there trying to kill those companies, but they are making headway into the industry. It's a harder, that's a more consolidated group. I don't see that on the asset side, and I'm sure there are technologies and things that are occurring. It's not obvious to me. The ROI isn't as obvious as some of the other pieces that have gotten more attention. I think that maybe kind of answered it, maybe not.
Anything else you guys want to add? All right, well, join me in thanking John, Dominique, and Fred, please.